Good afternoon to you, Mark Doyle, in barrister located in Sydney, Australia. Also, we have our Regional Director, Bhargav Reddy. A little background on both of these gentlemen. Bhargav graduated from Queen Mary Uni in London. He's based in Bangalore in South India. He's been working for us, closing in on 4 years as our Regional Director. Prior to that, he was with Pinkertons. He's also got another master's from one of the universities, one of the top unis in India. Mark Doyle is a barrister, as I mentioned, Sydney-based. He's also been in the Commandos in Australia. He was also a stint in artillery, and he was also a stint in the Royal Military College, Duntroon. Not in that order. So, gentlemen, today we're going to have a quick chat about COVID and what it's exposed about governance. To kick us off, I'm just going to raise some interesting statistics. Despite the various populations in the world, notably China at 1.4 billion, India at 1.3 billion, the first and winner of the most cases is the USA with 45.5 million COVID cases and 739,000 deaths. Coming in fourth is also a very self-proclaimed brilliance of democracy and capitalism, the United Kingdom, with 8.7 million cases and 138,000 deaths. And also in the top 15 are advanced nations, France, Italy, and Germany, all of whom, of course, all those five are members of the G20. Coming way down the stack and nestled together way back on the previous laps is Australia, which is 102nd with 136,000 cases and just over 1,500 deaths, and nestled up next to them with 135,000 cases is Singapore, immediately behind Australia in 103rd position, but they've had about 12 or 13% of the deaths of Australia, with 192 deaths compared to 1,500 deaths. Now, my first question is going to go to you, Mark, to get us rolling today. But when you look at the media in Australia, those statistics may come as a shock that Singapore is hardly affected at all, yet I'm sure it gets disparaging media down under. And Australia, with virtually no deaths and a nebulous amount of cases, has had significant lockdowns. I mean, Melbourne's the most locked down city in the world and probably just nudging Sydney by not far. Whereas in Singapore, we had a very powerful, very big lockdown. Only lasted for about 2 weeks, but it did the trick way back when, and we're talking about well over a year now. So how do you, obviously being, subject to the Aussie media, but having an interest in world affairs, how have you seen the Australian government's communication of policies, their decision-making? And to prompt you on that, I see that nearly every earth-shattering piece of brilliant idea they have is they've copied it from Singapore or Taiwan, who implemented it, more than a year ago. And then the politicians in Australia stand at a pulpit and blow their trumpet as if they've, had a Machiavellian epiphany that's broken the glass and they've brought their brilliance to bear. How do you see it being? Firstly, the lockdowns in Sydney, but the shenanigans going on with the politicians in the, as I love to refer to it, the blunder down under.
The Australian government has been very disappointing, in my view, and it's been highly inconsistent across the country. The federal government has been particularly poor in the slow rollout of the vaccination. What's been very disappointing has been the inconsistent application of the lockdowns across the country and the borders, and that's been a real disappointment. The other thing is, from what you've told me, the lockdowns seem to work a lot better if you get in hard and get in early, and that's where, if I can say it in the colloquial way, Australia has failed. Sydney in particular, they didn't get in early on the Delta outbreak, and we paid a heavy price for a long, long time. The way I see it internationally is the COVID outbreak has been a test for political power and political effectiveness. And the countries that are governed poorly, like the United States and England, have fared very, very poorly in this outbreak. And Trump has single-handedly destroyed his country, and through stupidity. I think England has also fared fairly poorly because of very poor management of the pandemic. Australia, with the lockdown, the strictest in the world, it's succeeded, but at what cost? And I would suggest that it's been a very, very heavy cost economically, but also in the extent of use of power in locking down the people. I don't think they should ever do it again. I don't think they should be able to lock people down for this. What tears me is that what is the other way out of this? And I don't think there is an easy answer to that, except you can lock down for a short amount of time very quickly, but it should be limited, because I think the effectiveness of the lockdown could have been better if they'd locked down early and quickly, but then lifted it so we could get back economically. I think it's been a big disappointment with the borders, the inconsistency with Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia, not managing this well together. And it's been something where you and I have discussed where I think we need to get rid of the states. Now, I don't think we'll ever do that, but I do think one of the lessons learned out of this pandemic is that there's got to be a national approach, and they shouldn't be allowed to lock borders down like they have ever again. That's one of the lessons that I've observed. Are there any questions?
If I can just raise a couple of points there. What is ludicrous and a bit of made Australia a laughing stock is the fact that they've gone and closed their borders and fundamentally not 100% prevented Australian citizens from returning, but pretty much made it so hard that they had to come back so slowly. They were more or less locked out of their own country. Now, they would argue on their pulpit with their hollow words that we told everybody to come home. Well, unfortunately, most people don't have a set of inbuilt wings, so they have to get an aeroplane. And so if you can't get a flight, you can't get a flight. Then they controlled numbers and either just, let's face it, mate, the way they've managed this crisis right from the outset was one-dimensional. They were so hell-bent on hospitals not getting overloaded that they forgot to think about mental health. They forgot to think about economies, supply chains. They didn't come up with an inclusive way to ensure that there was central control. They have bumbled their way through with changes of heart, changes of mind, a lack of analysis, a lack of planning. They've prevented their own citizens leaving the country and showed a massive amount of ineptness or naivety. In fact, let me be a little harsher than that, abject stupidity. They haven't considered that expatriates can't just stay home because Uncle ScoMo said so. They are contractually obliged to be where their employers want them. Businessmen, myself included, we can't just desert our staff, desert our clients. We are legally obligated to both, and we have an empathy for what we've created in the business and the people within it and their families. It's really been disappointing as an Australian citizen to see the British here laughing the hell off that, I think it was Sydney, controlled the distribution of how many beers and wines you could have at home. But the general belief in Asia amongst expatriates from other countries other than Australia and various nationalities is that the Aussie politicians act like a primary school teacher, though not quite as smart, and they treat, CEOs of companies and owners of companies and the COOs and various roles that people fulfill overseas, they treat them like little children. Now, I kind of think, even though Australia's got a real problem in that it's only got two political parties and they compete each election cycle to be the least worst. But obviously there's going to be a change in government. I mean, the whole farcical climate change debacle by the Liberal government. But the real thing that concerns me, Mark, is Australia, you know, it's got uranium, it's got coal, it's got all these different minerals, agriculture, a wonderful legal system that we inherited from the Brits, yet it seems to be mismanaging a country, even though it's been given such a wonderful start. How complicit or how linked are the media? Now, I know we want to have separations of power, but surely the media really needs to be able to act independently and not a part of a government consortium, because no other country's doing every premier of a state and every prime minister or every health minister's spending 15 to 20 minutes and longer at a pulpit like a priest in Oklahoma. Has the government and to a degree the opposition, are they really about controlling the media and hand picking the media and starving society of international news? Because that's, yes, go ahead.
Complicit in the ridiculously stupid management of this pandemic. And if one thing the pandemic has taught us is that it's punished the stupid. And your point that the pandemic has been poorly managed by the government is made out by looking across the world at every government that's done poorly, and it's been a test of political power. Now, you know, our mutual friend, Paul, the analyst that we spoke to about at the beginning of this, Phil, and you'll recall that he said this will be for governments across the world, and any government that is effective will succeed. Look, read Singapore, and anyone that is poor will be punished, and read America and England. In Australia, the complicity with the press has been like a textbook example of poor press management by the government, and the press have made people panic. They've reported in a not a broad way, in a stupid, directed way that makes people not do the right thing. The government's really poorly managed simple messages to people about vaccination. Go and get vaccinated early. They didn't help by not allowing enough people to get vaccinated quickly. The Delta outbreak could have been prevented in Sydney had they locked down within the first day or two of that bloke being discovered, the driver. That could have been managed effectively. There's so many lessons that should be learned from this pandemic. But one, there should be a national approach. Two, there should be effective press management. Three, there should be the government should have a proper pandemic plan that could be managed across all states, and there should be the lockdown should be a thing of not a quick resort, but not be imposed for too long to punish the people. One of the big things that in this pandemic that's alarmed me is that someone said to me, perhaps, I don't know, a year ago, that Australia is one of the most undemocratic democracies in the world. And I remembered being alarmed when I heard that, but this pandemic has proven that. Absolutely. That
absolutely. Agree.
We are 1 degree away from North Korea in being punished and treated like children.
Yes.
And it's been alarming for me. And the enforcement of the lockdown in Sydney has been very ineffectual and unfairly managed, where the people in Bondi could virtually do what they liked, mostly, and people in the poorer suburbs were treated like criminals, including, and it's shameful. absolute shameful and highly embarrassing and alarming. And I've had a few clients ring me as a result of COVID-related activity, and there's been, luckily, the police have been fairly good in managing this, notwithstanding the ridiculous orders coming from the government.
Yes.
And that's been a blessing. And there's been police, anecdotal stories of police being quite fair in their management of this, by and large. But there are very poor examples of people, mostly poor people and young people, getting monstered by the police, depending on where you live. It's been a very alarming thing during this pandemic.
Yeah, and look, Bhargav, just to ask you, Mr. Narendra Modi too, he's and the government not dissimilar, right? That they didn't take lockdown seriously. I mean, I quoted the number of fatalities before between Australia and Singapore, and Australians are sitting down in Australia thinking they're a world leader in everything. And that's because they can overfund swimming, and they go to the Olympic Games, and then they enter a global competition with an extension of self-deception that they're good at everything, and that they're a modern country with great internet communications and all the other fallacies that they live by. But Singapore's only had 190 deaths compared to Australia's 1,500, yet they've had the same amount of cases. So you have to ask about the health system's capability, the capability of the doctors, the existent equipments that they have access to, but also societal discipline. Despite what Aussies think that Singapore is some kind of police state, it's actually a lot more fair and democratic and open, and they make very clear decisions. Their government are accountable for those decisions. They actually have this concept where if politicians aren't doing their job, they can get sacked. Imagine that, accountability on politicians. But what the Singaporean government's done is, if it says we're doing a lockdown, what it means by that is we're doing a lockdown. There's not exceptions, there's not procrastinations. The other thing Singapore did was it took SARS and all the other little endemics very seriously and learnt from it. It's like, I remember I went through military college prior to done Truant Officer Cadet School Portsea, and in true Australian fashion, we were based down in Melbourne, not far from the Antarctic, and it's just slightly warmer. And it was predominantly a jungle warfare training college for Vietnam, which had finished, 50 years prior to that. Kind of think that Australia will, go back to watching Aussie rules cricket and not learn anything, Mark. But Bhargav, Mr. Modi, the Indian government, your take?
Well, I can't describe the government better than saying they are reactive and not proactive. Discipline is something which doesn't exist among the society at all. And that's very hard to find, with a few exceptions. Some states are better than the others. Overall, the government's performance has been inept and inefficient. They refused to learn what happened in the first wave. They let their guard down, and they were hit by this massive shortage of oxygen and other medical equipment in the second wave this year. In the first wave, they were busy thumping their chest, saying that they're way ahead of the rest of the world. Towards the end of the first wave, they actually realized they had no better. They were really, really hit hard. And in the second wave, it was a debacle. And this is a problem of not learning from what's actually literally in front of them, rather than being arrogant and being smug about how they have performed. And this actually is rooted in the society itself. There is a sense of arrogance that they are better than the rest of the world. Apparently, it's a 3,000-year-old civilization. Somehow they are supposed to be better than the West, who doesn't know anything. Apparently, the West was living in the trees when there was a civilization had in India. But that doesn't really reflect in the current scenario whatsoever. Because every society, every civilization has a cycle. They go through a trough. They also go through an upswing. India is not in that upswing at all. If we take from the first day of independence, that is 15th of August 1947, it's a long way to go. I know it's been 75 odd years, but still, we have a lot of ground to cover when we compare ourselves to some of the bigger countries, or even more efficient countries like Singapore, or even Thailand for that matter. I always marvel at the discipline of what Thailand and even Vietnam has. Their deaths are nowhere comparable to some of the similarly sized states in India. We need to remember, India is a federal state, and the federalism is structured around not just administrative systems, they are structured around socio-cultural differences along ethnic as well as linguistic lines. So let's say if we take a state which is similarly sized, that is my own state, Karnataka, around 65 to 70 million people, similar in territory as well. We have 3 times, or let's say 5 times the amount of deaths in Karnataka than in Thailand. Overall, India's death rate is somewhere around 450,000 deaths. That's the official number. Real number, we never know. There are a lot of conspiracies. And there are about 34 million confirmed cases. I'm guessing that the actual cases are double that. So in the actual performance of the state, despite all the challenges what India faces, they refuse to learn. And that has been a major challenge. See, in the nature, pandemics are bound to occur. We can't really control that beyond a point if we take the traditional route. But at the same time, what the leaders and the politicians could do is actually learn from what has happened in the past and get prepared for the next hit, or the next wave, as we call it these days. But they didn't do that. In fact, they went into a campaign drive for state elections earlier this year, literally a few days before the second wave. I mean, I have no words to explain that, Paul.
Well, it's funny because we're seeing Mark's point about when we chatted with the analyst Phil, and at the time, to Phil and to Mark and I, things were very obviously going to occur. But had we written that in our assessments, we would have been laughed out by the other risk players, the multinationals, because everybody's thinking is kind of an extension of the cultures they come from. Some farcical things that are almost hilarious if they weren't true was yesterday Indonesia made an announcement that we're not going to let Singapore in. People from Singapore come to Bali because, it's got so many cases and it's out of control. Now, to put that into reality away from the Indonesian politicking, Singapore 192 deaths. Indonesia, is last time I checked, was at about 143,000. Okay. And so it is hilarious to basically just think about how countries put on a spin to deflect rather than to analyze. Now, Mark, you talk about the chest pumping. I think if this was a Duntroon exercise, we'd get Modi and we'd get the New South Wales government to sit together and we could have a little chat about, hey, how do you think you went? Oh, I think we did really well. Right. You're going to a board of studies and your next stop's a removal truck, sunshine, because they both failed to enforce a plan. Well, they failed to have a plan. They failed to have a plan in time, and then they failed to enforce it. And then sad when the police have to go and correct decisions by implementing common sense, because ideally you'd want the police implementing rules, not trying to correct barbarian ones. Now, an obvious fix for all of this is I'm going to get the Singapore government, I'm going to clone it, and I'm going to send one version of the Singapore government over for you, Bhargav, and one to you, Mark, and then you can use them for one-on-one in your own nations. How's that?
It's a solution. It's a solution. But Paul, Australia had a pandemic plan, but it was a very, very poor one, and it didn't work. And they've got to come out of this with some real lessons learned and make some real changes for the next pandemic. As well as this pandemic is not over. by any stretch. And
Yes.
there'll be more variants. At the moment, we've got the Delta variant. I wonder what the Echo and Foxtrot variants will be like, whether they'll be more virulent and more dangerous. And the expectation, well, let's just see. If we're lucky, no. But if we're unlucky, we could be in for some more drama in this country for a long time. And I hope that they start, that Morrison and company, or whichever mob get in on the next election, federal election, start working better with the states to control this pandemic. It's alarming, Paul.
Yeah, and look, Mark, I mean, something that really stood out to me as an example of how trashy the media is and how Canberra and various factions in most states are run by politicians that can't think straight. They've been elected to run policy, but they want to run crises. Okay, yes, you're ultimately responsible for the crisis, but how many months into buying some vaccines and distributing them did they have to call in a general to fix it? And then to make matters worse, you had very poor thinking and very poor toxic journalism. Samantha Maiden of the crediblenews.com.au, which is about as objective as the Mirror's page 3 in the UK, stating, something along the lines of stating inter alia, what's a general going to do? Is shoot the virus? And that kind of trash on, insiders, which used to be a very good analysis, an objective analysis of politics, it has also gone down the path of appeasement and popularity, and you must all agree with what the people in Canberra are saying, otherwise you don't actually get in to ask your predetermined questions. So I can't see Australia being able to get the government back on a leash. I mean, the system of governance is out of control. The politicians aren't accountable. I mean, Mark, you've got a legal background. Apparently some sexual harassment laws and a couple of other key laws, Parliament House wasn't subject to them. How does that work? How can Parliament be exempt from laws that protect people from being victims? How does that work? I mean, I haven't seen that. I've seen it in corrupt countries, but in a country that's supposedly got a good system of government, how does that come about?
There's been a recent case of sexual harassment, it's sexual assault, where a staffer has been charged criminally. So it's not exempt, but there's a culture where things are covered up, and sadly, where people, primarily females, are sexually harassed and don't complain because of a culture of covering up and a culture of don't complain or you'll lose your job. That's what's got to change, and that's what's going on. It's as old as time itself here in Australia. One person is being called to account. He's been charged criminally. I think the same person recently got a second charge brought against him. I hope I'm right in saying that. And he'll be brought to account. But what's not brought to account is the culture in federal parliament with regards to sexual harassment. It's poor. I would hate to send my daughter or my sister to that place to work, or to be a staffer, or to be a female in that environment. I would not like that. I would not want them there in the current culture. But we've digressed from our discussion with regards to
as we always do. Well, look, at that note, we might wind it up. Mark, thanks a lot for taking the time out of your day, and you too, Bhargav. Appreciate it. Thanks very much, gents. Cheerio.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Bhargav.